Imagine it's 1988. You're a mid-level engineer at a state manufacturing plant in Leningrad. You've worked here for 23 years. Your father worked here before you. Your apartment is modest but secure. Your pension is guaranteed by the state. Your children attend university for free. You read the papers. You watch the evening news. There's talk of reform, of perestroika, of opening up. Some things are changing, but the buses still run. The factory still operates. Your salary still arrives on time. There is no panic in the streets. No lines at the banks. No soldiers enforcing martial law. And yet, 3 years from now, the country you were born in will no longer exist. Your pension will be worthless. Your factory will be sold to men you've never heard of for a fraction of its value. Your life savings will evaporate, not in a dramatic crash, but in a slow, quiet dissolution that you won't fully understand until it's already complete. You won't see the collapse coming because it won't look like a collapse. This is the pattern that historians document but economists rarely discuss. Empires do not collapse with bank runs. They do not end with a single dramatic failure. The fall of Rome was not a stock market crash. The British Empire did not declare bankruptcy. The Soviet Union did not experience a hyperinflationary spiral in its final months. And yet all of them ended. What killed them was something far more difficult to see: the slow, systematic transfer of real wealth from those who built the empire to those who managed its decline. The gradual replacement of productive capacity with administrative complexity. The invisible mathematics of currency debasement compounding over decades. The quiet death of institutions that once worked. This isn't theory, it's documented history. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. The most dangerous collapses are the ones that don't look like collapses. The ones where the ATMs still work, the stock market still rises, and the official statistics still report growth, while the actual purchasing power of the average citizen erodes year after year, generation after generation. This is how empires actually end. Not with a bang that everyone remembers, with a slow suffocation that no one can point to. When most people imagine an empire collapsing, they picture something cinematic. They imagine bank runs, long lines of panicked citizens trying to withdraw cash before the doors close. They imagine currency becoming worthless overnight, people carrying wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread, like the famous photographs from Weimar Germany in 1923. They imagine a moment, a clear before and after. This expectation is not accidental, it's conditioned. The 1929 crash, the 2008 financial crisis, the Greek debt emergency, these events were dramatic, visible, and well documented. They had clear villains and identifiable victims. They made for good stories. And so we've come to believe that systemic failure must look like this, that if something truly catastrophic were happening, we would know. We would see it on the news, experts would warn us, someone would do something. This belief is dangerous, because the most consequential collapses in human history did not look like crises at all until they were already over. Consider Rome. The Western Roman Empire is traditionally dated as ending in 476 AD, when the Germanic leader Odoacer deposed the last emperor. But that event was so unremarkable at the time that many people living through it didn't realize an empire had ended. There was no declaration of collapse, no official announcement. The administrative structures continued to function. The Senate still met. Taxes were still collected. Life in most provinces went on more or less as before. The collapse had already happened. It had been happening for 200 years. The final removal of the last emperor was not the cause. It was the effect, so delayed that it barely registered as a historical event at the time. Most people living in the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD did not know they were living in a fallen empire. That is the pattern. The real mechanism of imperial collapse is not dramatic failure, it's gradual extraction. Let me be precise about what this means. An empire, at its core, is a system that coordinates productive capacity across a large territory. It builds roads, maintains order, defends borders, and administers trade. In exchange, it extracts resources, taxes, labor, commodities from the population. When an empire is ascending, the value it provides exceeds the cost it extracts. Roads improve trade. Military protection allows farmers to plant crops without fear of raiders. Legal systems make commerce predictable. The empire creates more wealth than it consumes. But this relationship inverts as empires mature. Administrative structures grow. Military costs increase. The complexity of managing distant territories multiplies. Interest payments on past debts compound. The empire begins consuming more than it creates. And here's the critical point. This inversion does not announce itself. There is no quarterly report showing that the empire has become a net extractor rather than a net producer. There is no press conference. The taxes still get collected. The roads still exist. The army still patrols. But the math has changed, and the math always wins. The primary tool of gradual imperial extraction is currency debasement. This is not complicated, but it is systematically obscured. When an empire can no longer raise sufficient revenue through direct taxation, it faces a choice. It can reduce expenditures, cutting military, administration, or public benefits. It can raise taxes explicitly, provoking political resistance, or it can quietly reduce the value of the currency. The third option is almost always chosen, because it is invisible. In Rome, this meant reducing the silver content of the denarius. In 64 AD, under Nero, the denarius contained approximately 94% silver. By the reign of Gallienus in the 260s, it contained less than 5%. The coins looked the same. They had the same names. They were used in the same transactions. But they were not the same. A Roman soldier in 64 AD, paid 25 denarii per month, was receiving roughly 85 grams of pure silver. A Roman soldier in 268 AD, paid a nominally higher salary, might receive less than 10 grams of silver equivalent. The soldier was not told his pay had been cut by 88%. He was told he was being paid the same or more. The debasement was hidden in the mechanism of the currency itself. Think about what that means. For 200 years, the Roman state systematically transferred wealth from savers, soldiers, and workers to the administrative apparatus without ever announcing that it was doing so, without ever passing a law that said, "We are taking your wealth." The extraction was invisible because it was embedded in the medium of exchange. This is not ancient history. This is the template. In 1945, the British Empire was the largest in human history. It governed over 450 million people across every continent. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency, backed by the gold standard and centuries of financial credibility. 20 years later, Britain was struggling to maintain the value of the pound. 30 years later, it required an emergency bailout from the International Monetary Fund. There was no bank run, no hyperinflation, no dramatic collapse. What happened? The mathematics of empire reversed. During World War II, Britain borrowed massively, primarily from the United States. It liquidated foreign assets. It consumed its stored wealth to survive. The Lend-Lease program alone required Britain to exhaust its gold and dollar reserves before American aid would flow. By 1945, Britain had won the war and lost its financial independence. The pound remained the empire's currency. British institutions continued to function. The Bank of England still operated. The stock market still traded. But the underlying productive capacity, the real wealth generation, had shifted. The United States now held the gold. The United States now had the manufacturing base. The United States now had the creditor position. Britain's empire continued to exist on paper for decades. Decolonization happened gradually, negotiated, managed. The transitions were orderly. Headlines celebrated peaceful handovers. But the empire was already gone. It had been gone since the moment the math reversed, probably around 1941, when Britain could no longer finance its own war. Everything after that was administration of a decline that had already occurred. Every transfer of wealth has a recipient. When an empire debases its currency or depletes its productive capacity, that value doesn't disappear. It moves. In the Roman case, currency debasement benefited the military hierarchy and the administrative class, the groups closest to new money creation. Soldiers received nominally higher payments before prices adjusted. Administrators controlled the flow of resources. Those with physical assets, land, commodities, productive enterprises, saw their holdings retain real value while currency holders lost. The pattern is consistent across empires. In Britain's decline, American financial institutions, American manufacturing corporations, and American political structures absorbed the positions that British counterparts vacated. The pound's loss was the dollar's gain. British foreign investments were liquidated to pay war debts, purchased often by American buyers at favorable terms. In the Soviet collapse, those with access to state assets, factory managers, party officials, early market participants, acquired real resources at prices that reflected the dysfunction of the Soviet system, not the actual value of the assets. This is not conspiracy, it is mechanism. When a currency is debased, the first receivers of new money benefit at the expense of later receivers. When an empire liquidates assets, the buyers benefit at the expense of the sellers. When productive capacity shifts, the new centers benefit at the expense of the old. There is always a transfer. The question is only from whom and to whom. The cost is always paid by those who cannot see the mechanism. In Rome, it was paid by soldiers who served for decades, only to find their pensions would buy a fraction of what they expected. It was paid by farmers who sold crops for coins that lost value before they could spend them. It was paid by merchants who extended credit in one currency and were repaid in something that looked identical but was worth less. In Britain, it was paid by pensioners whose savings, denominated in sterling, lost purchasing power steadily through the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. It was paid by workers whose wages rose nominally but fell in real terms. It was paid by a generation that had sacrificed for victory and received decline. In the Soviet Union, It was paid by the engineer in Leningrad whose life's work was denominated in a currency that ceased to function, in pension promises that evaporated, in institutional guarantees that dissolved. The pattern is always the same. Those who hold claims on the system, savings accounts, pensions, fixed salaries, government bonds, are paid in full, nominally. Every promise is kept in numerical terms, but the value behind those numbers is extracted before the payment is made. A pensioner receiving exactly the pension they were promised, in a currency that buys half of what it did when the promise was made, has not been paid. They have been defaulted upon, in a form of default that cannot be recognized, cannot be protested, and cannot be addressed through any existing legal mechanism. This is why there are no bank runs. The bank is open, the account is accessible, the numbers are correct, the extraction is complete. Every declining empire eventually reaches a point of irreversibility. This is not a political judgment, it is a mathematical one. The constraint can take several forms. In Rome, it was the demographic and productive collapse of the core provinces. There were simply not enough people farming enough land to generate the surplus needed to maintain the military frontier. The system required growth, and growth had stopped. In Britain, it was the debt load from 2 world wars combined with the loss of colonial extraction. The cost of administering the empire exceeded the revenue it generated. No political decision could reverse this. The numbers didn't work. In the Soviet Union, it was the gap between reported economic output and actual productive capacity. The system's planning mechanisms required accurate information, but the incentive structures produced systematic falsification. By the 1980s, the gap between official reality and actual reality was too large to bridge. At a certain point, in every imperial decline, the options narrow to a set that contains only variations of managed collapse. Option 1, explicit default. Announce that promises cannot be kept. Face immediate political crisis, potential revolution, certain loss of power for current leadership. Option 2, implicit default through debasement. Maintain nominal promises while extracting real value through currency dilution. Slower, less visible, preserves political structures longer. Option 3, external extraction. Shift the cost to peripheral territories, vassal states, or future generations. Extend the timeline at someone else's expense. These are the only options. Notice what is not on the list: a return to sustainable growth, a painless solution, a political reform that reverses the mathematics. By the time an empire reaches this constraint, those possibilities are no longer available. That's the trap. This explains why empires collapse without bank runs. A bank run is a loss of confidence. It requires the population to recognize that the system cannot meet its obligations and to act on that recognition before others do. But gradual debasement prevents that recognition. If the currency loses 3% of its purchasing power per year, that loss is imperceptible in daily life. Prices rise, but slowly. Wages adjust, but with a lag. The mechanism operates below the threshold of political awareness. Compound that 3% over 20 years, and you have lost 45% of your purchasing power. Over 50 years, 78%. Over a working lifetime, the majority of your savings have been extracted. But at no point was there a crisis. At no point did anyone announce that a transfer was occurring. At no point did the ATMs close, the banks fail, or the currency collapse. The system continued to function, in the sense that transactions could still be processed. The government continued to operate. The institutions maintained their forms. What changed was the substance beneath the forms. This is the genius of gradual extraction. It operates through the preservation of normalcy. It requires no conspiracy, no secret plan, no malicious actors. It emerges naturally from the incentive structures of a system that can no longer generate sufficient real wealth to meet its obligations. The system does not collapse. It hollows out. And by the time the hollowness is visible, the collapse has already occurred. Currency debasement is only one mechanism. Institutional decay operates alongside it. An empire's strength is not just its currency or its military. It is its institutions, the organizations that actually make things work, courts that enforce contracts, schools that transmit knowledge, infrastructure that enables commerce, bureaucracies that administer fairly. These institutions also hollow out. In the late Roman Empire, the cursus honorum, the traditional sequence of political offices, became disconnected from actual administrative competence. Positions were bought, inherited, or assigned based on political loyalty rather than capability. The forms remained, the substance decayed. The Roman road system, once the marvel of the ancient world, gradually deteriorated. Maintenance was deferred. Bridges went unrepaired. The roads still existed. You could still travel on them, but each year they were slightly less useful, slightly more dangerous, slightly more evidence of a capacity that had been lost. In the Soviet Union, the planning apparatus became progressively disconnected from physical reality. Factory managers reported production targets as met regardless of actual output. Statistical bureaus compiled numbers that aggregated to impossible totals. The system ran on information that bore decreasing relation to the world it claimed to describe. In each case, the institutions continued to exist. They had budgets, personnel, buildings, and official mandates. They produced reports and held meetings and maintained hierarchies. But they no longer performed the functions they were designed to perform. This decay is difficult to measure because it operates through the gap between form and function. An outsider, or even an insider not looking carefully, sees an institution that appears operational. The degradation is visible only in outcomes. Contracts that take longer to enforce, graduates who know less, infrastructure that fails more frequently, bureaucratic processes that produce arbitrary rather than predictable results. By the time the decay is undeniable, the capacity to reverse it has also decayed. How fast does this happen? The historical evidence suggests a pattern of slow initial decline followed by acceleration. Rome's debasement occurred over approximately 2 centuries, from Nero in 64 AD to the crisis of the 3rd century. But the crisis itself compressed decades of consequences into years. The period from 235 to 284 AD saw over 50 different emperors, most dying violently, most lasting only months. Britain's imperial decline began arguably in 1914 with the abandonment of the gold standard to finance World War I. It accelerated through World War II. The visible political dismantling, Indian independence, Suez, African decolonization, occurred over roughly 20 years. But the financial foundations had shifted decades before. The Soviet Union operated under increasing strain from at least the mid-1970s. Oil revenues masked systemic dysfunction during the high-price years. When prices fell in the mid-1980s, the timeline compressed. The visible collapse from 1989 to 1991 was astonishingly fast for an entity that had appeared permanent. The pattern suggests a critical threshold. Below that threshold, a system can absorb strain. Deferred maintenance accumulates, but doesn't immediately break anything. Currency debasement erodes wealth, but doesn't trigger immediate crisis. Institutional decay reduces efficiency, but doesn't halt operations. Above that threshold, everything happens quickly. The system maintained by accumulated credibility exhausts that credibility. The infrastructure maintained by deferred maintenance experiences cascading failures. The currency supported by historical confidence encounters a crisis of faith. The population does not see the slow accumulation. They experience only the sudden acceleration, and by then, the options have already narrowed to the variations of managed collapse. Contemporary financial systems have evolved mechanisms that make this process even more invisible than in historical empires. Consider the structure of modern currency debasement. In Rome, debasement was physical. You could, in principle, weigh a coin or assay its silver content. In the Soviet Union, debasement operated through administered prices and currency controls, distorting but with visible friction. Modern fiat currencies operate without physical constraints. The money supply can be expanded digitally, instantly, without limit. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from approximately $900 billion in 2008 to over $9 trillion by 2022. No physical coins were debased. No price controls were implemented. The purchasing power transferred was enormous, but the mechanism was invisible to anyone not specifically tracking monetary aggregates. Inflation statistics are constructed to minimize the apparent impact. Substitution adjustments assume that consumers switch to cheaper alternatives. Hedonic adjustments assume that quality improvements offset price increases. Housing costs are measured through owner's equivalent rent rather than actual house prices. These methodologies are documented. They are publicly available. They are not secret. But their cumulative effect is to report inflation systematically lower than the experienced increase in cost of living, particularly for middle-class households spending on housing, healthcare, and education. The gap between reported inflation and experienced cost increases is the modern equivalent of the gap between a denarius's face value and its silver content. The extraction is real. The mechanism is invisible. There's another mechanism operating in modern systems that historical empires did not fully exploit. The systematic extraction of future wealth through debt structures. When an empire debases currency, it extracts wealth from current holders. When it accumulates debt, it extracts wealth from future holders, from people who have not yet earned and, in some cases, not yet been born. This is not metaphor. It is mathematics. A government bond is a claim on future tax revenue. When a government issues debt, it is committing the future productive capacity of its population to service that debt. If the debt grows faster than the productive capacity, the future population faces an impossible choice: default, currency debasement, or perpetual extraction to service inherited obligations. Consider the trajectory. United States federal debt stood at approximately $5.7 trillion in 2000. By 2024, it exceeded $34 trillion. This represents a claim on future American production that must be serviced through some combination of taxation, currency dilution, or default. The interest cost alone now exceeds $1 trillion annually. This is wealth transferred from future American taxpayers to current holders of Treasury securities, which include foreign governments, domestic financial institutions, and the Federal Reserve itself. The population who will bear this cost includes people currently in elementary school. It includes people not yet born. They have made no decisions. They have signed no agreements. They have accumulated no benefits. But they will pay. This is the most invisible form of imperial extraction, the quiet transfer of obligations to those who cannot object because they do not yet exist. If this mechanism is so well documented, why does it continue? The answer lies in incentive structures, not malice. Each participant in the system is acting rationally within their time horizon. Politicians facing elections cannot implement austerity that produces visible pain before the next vote. Central bankers maintaining institutional credibility cannot announce that their policies are extractive. Investors seeking returns cannot refuse to hold the currency that denominates most global trade. No individual decision-maker benefits from breaking the pattern. Each decision-maker benefits from extending it slightly longer. A politician who cuts spending loses the next election to a politician who doesn't. A central banker who tightens policy during a crisis is blamed for the resulting pain, while the predecessor who created the conditions escapes accountability. A business that refuses to participate in debt-financed expansion is outcompeted by businesses that do. The system selects for participants who extend it. The participants who would end it are removed, not through conspiracy, but through the ordinary operation of competitive pressure. This is why empires don't reform their way out of decline. The individuals who would implement reform face immediate personal costs, while the benefits accrue to people who cannot vote, cannot pay, and in some cases do not exist. The incentive structure makes continuation the only individually rational choice, even when it is collectively catastrophic. How would you know if you were living through this? The historical evidence suggests you probably wouldn't. The engineer in Leningrad didn't know. The British pensioner in 1965 didn't know. The Roman soldier receiving debased coins didn't know. They experienced symptoms. Things were harder than they remembered. Promises didn't stretch as far as expected. Institutions didn't work quite as well as they should. But the mechanism producing these symptoms was invisible. If you tried to explain it, you would sound paranoid. The bank is open. The currency exists. The government is still operating. What collapse are you talking about? This is the recognition problem. The evidence of gradual extraction looks exactly like normal economic life until it doesn't. There's no moment where the reasonable person can point to a specific failure and say, this is the collapse. By the time failure is undeniable, the extraction is complete. The wealth has been transferred. The productive capacity has been consumed. The institutions have hollowed. The options have narrowed. And everyone asks, why didn't anyone see this coming? The answer is that some people did. But what they described sounded indistinguishable from normal complaint. Prices are too high. The currency doesn't buy what it used to. Institutions don't work like they should. The future looks harder than the past. These observations are always true in declining systems. They are also always true in normal economic friction. The difference is the trajectory, and the trajectory is visible only in retrospect. Let me be clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not predicting collapse. I'm not naming dates. I'm not offering investment advice or suggesting specific actions. I'm describing a pattern that has occurred repeatedly in human history, under consistent conditions, with consistent mechanisms, producing consistent outcomes. Empires that cannot generate sufficient real wealth to meet their obligations have three options: explicit default, implicit default through debasement, or external extraction. They choose the second and third options until they are exhausted, then experience the first. The process operates invisibly because it is implemented through mechanisms that preserve the forms of normalcy while extracting the substance. The population that bears the cost is systematically prevented from recognizing the extraction, partly by the mechanism's invisibility, partly by the institutional incentives that punish accurate description. This is what history documents. Whether the current global system follows this pattern is not a question I am qualified to answer, but the mechanisms I have described are operating. Currency expansion is occurring. Debt is accumulating. Institutional performance appears to be degrading in measurable ways. The gap between reported statistics and lived experience appears to be widening. These are observations, not predictions. Draw your own conclusions. If there's a single concept to retain from this analysis, it is irreversibility. The defining feature of imperial decline is not that things get worse. Things often get worse for temporary reasons and then recover. Recessions end, wars conclude, natural disasters pass. The defining feature is that the capacity to recover has been consumed. Rome didn't just experience a bad century in the 200s. It consumed the institutional, demographic, and productive reserves that would have enabled recovery. When Diocletian stabilized the empire, he did so through methods, price controls, coerced labor, military autocracy, that created a different system, not a restored one. Britain didn't just experience post-war austerity, it liquidated the foreign investments, the creditor position, and the industrial advantage that had made empire possible. The recovery was into a different status, a medium power rather than a hegemon. The Soviet Union didn't just experience a reform period. It had consumed the ideological credibility, the productive capacity, and the institutional legitimacy that could have enabled a reformed continuation. What emerged was not a reformed Soviet Union, but a different set of states. In each case, there was a moment before which reform was possible, and after which it was not. That moment was invisible. No announcement was made, no line was crossed. But the math had changed, and the math doesn't negotiate. Let me return to where we began. The engineer in Leningrad, 1988, secure in his assumptions, unable to see what was already complete. He represents every person who has ever lived through an imperial decline without recognizing it. Every Roman who noticed prices rising but trusted the currency. Every British subject who saw the empire shrinking but assumed it would stabilize. Every Soviet citizen who sensed dysfunction but believed the system would adapt. They were not stupid. They were not ignorant. They were operating within systems designed to make the extraction invisible. They experienced symptoms but could not identify causes. They felt the weight but could not see the hands. And when the visible collapse came, the final emperors, the last flag lowerings, the dissolution announcements, they were surprised. Because they had been told they would see it coming. They had been told there would be bank runs, panicked crowds, dramatic failures. Instead, there was just a long, slow exhalation, and then a different world. The question is not whether this pattern exists. History has answered that. The question is whether you can recognize the symptoms while it's still useful to recognize them. Most people never do. The pattern completes in the space between what the numbers say and what the numbers mean. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice, investment guidance, or prediction of specific future events. If this analysis was useful, hit subscribe and tap the bell icon, because this channel exists to study the autopsies before they repeat. The pattern is already documented, whether you see it or not.